Good afternoon. My name is Dustin Dupas, Chief Operating Officer at Tabs Group. I'd like to welcome you to another webinar where we share information on issues of interest to the CPG industry. Since January of 2013, Tabs Group has provided these webinars on a regular basis, and will continue to do so as long as we continue to grow our audience and deliver value to the industry. You can access recordings of all of our prior webinars at webinars.tabsgroup.com. Our next webinar is scheduled for next month on Thursday, October 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll present the same study, but this one will be our first one for the Canadian market. This study will compare Canadian purchasing patterns to those in the U.S. Today's webcast will be the results of the Tabs Group third annual Consumer Value Study for the consumables sector. This is the third year that Tabs Group has fielded questions to consumers about their purchase frequency of leading consumable categories, the outlets where they buy these products, and what type of deals they prefer to buy. Given the historic weakness we've seen in the CPG industry, this information, now more than ever, is vital to provide insight into how these trends can be turned around. Our presenter today is Dr. Kurt Jetta, CEO and founder of Tabs Group. At the end of the presentation, we'll open the floor to questions that you can submit via the chat box at the top of your screen. I'd like to thank all of you that join us for these webinars and also for spreading the word to your friends and colleagues. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jetta.
Thank you, Dustin, and thank you for all those that have attended this afternoon. As Dustin mentioned, I'll review the results of our third annual Consumer Value Study on consumables. And the focus, there's two areas of focus. One is just understanding the trends in consumables, but secondly is how do consumer deals really help shape some of the trends and the weaknesses that we're seeing. Let me get into the methodology of the study. Similar to other webinars, we rely on online consumer surveys to 1,000 adults 18 to 75. Last 2 years, 2013 and 2014, we used TNS. We've switched suppliers this year to Caravan, who's also has a nationally representative sample. And we did some rigorous validation to make sure that there was no disruption in trends due to that switch in supplier. So we're confident that what we're looking at is a genuine trend as we've corroborated it with other in-market data. As I mentioned, areas of questions, categories purchase and purchase frequency. So we've consistently asked 15 categories. And these really are categories that are bellwethers for the entire CPG industry. In fact, they reflect 20% of CPG retail dollars, and they reflect some of the major players like Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Kellogg's, General Mills, Nestle, Dr. Pepper, et cetera. So some of the real major presences in our industry would be reflected in this data. We ask how strongly they agree on some questions on deal tactics utilized, and we ask 10 of them. Which will ask about strong agreements on 4 trendy or on-trend type of topics that we'll get to later on. And then finally, where do they purchase consumables regularly? And by regularly, we define that as at least 6 times per year. Now, understanding that the average of a typical grocery store is over 20. So regular, we've set a very low bar for regular purchasing, and that definition actually will become very relevant when we talk about some of the outlet trends. Now, we did not ask specific grocery banner breaks. It was more channel-specific information. And when we get all of this data, as we do with all our surveys, we first of all validate it internally to make sure that the results are consistent with what we would expect to be true. So, for example, we don't want to see heavy, younger consumers buying more, say, vitamins than older consumers when we know older consumers are, much heavier buyers of that type of product. So that's something we would do in, say, our vitamin study. And we also do a lot of external industry corroboration, either through known data sources such as household panel data and use purchase frequency data, or we look at do Google search and see what else is being said about the industry, where are their weaknesses. Also looking at quarterly earnings reports, which is very helpful and for us to make sure that we're corroborating some of these results. One thing we do want to make you aware of, and it only really affects one of the questions and charts that we'll show, is we know that there's a frequency understatement in the couple of categories that have a very high contribution of single-serve products, and that being carb, bev, and water. So if we report out that the average number of purchases is 9 per year or something like that, just understanding that that is excluding some of the single-serve transactions, which really jack that number up. And it really is purchase frequency that we're trying to validate to. And if you look at some of our earlier webinars, we've done quite a bit of work to make sure that people's reported purchasing on regular purchasing does correlate highly with what things that we can measure through household panel data in terms of purchase frequency. So today we're going to review consumables category trends. We'll look at the key demographics that comprise some of those trends and what are the most important demographics. What are the deal preferences, as I mentioned, where are the people shopping, and then what are their attitudes towards certain on-trend topics. Just a few definitions just to clarify when we talk about heavy buyers, heavy deal users. So there will be times I'll talk about a very heavy buyer. That is only when it refers to a specific category, like a very heavy buyer of cereal or a very heavy buyer of frozen pizza. And we define that as 12 or more times per year or once per month. That was the highest box that could be checked as far as purchase frequency on a 1 to 5 scale. So 1 point would be never buy, 2 points is buy once or twice a year, etc. Heavy buyer, when we talk about heavy buyer, that's not to be confused with very heavy buyer. Heavy buyer refers to the whole sector, the total consumables, all 15 categories. And the way we do that is we take all 15 categories, as I mentioned, we provide points to each response on frequency, and any respondent that had 55 or more points is considered a heavy buyer. Why we don't do an average frequency is we don't want to bias it toward 1 or 2 categories that they might buy very heavily and the rest might be marginal. So this is a way to include both kind of the reach and frequency of category purchasing. And then finally, a heavy deal user, and also we're talking about the entire sector and not specific categories. Anybody that uses regularly at least 5 of the 10 deal tactics that we have laid out to them, and we'll go through those in that part of the presentation. So let's get right to the data now. And the first thing that really jumped out as we were going through the data is how significantly the category had dropped. And remember, when we say a decline of 4%, that is what we're projecting decline in transactions, not necessarily volume or dollars, but we do know that dollars and volume have been historically weak over the last 3 years, and I would claim that this is the most underreported story in our industry. You really don't see anything about some of the weaknesses that we're experiencing in any of the trade press. You do read about it when you see quarterly earnings announcements by some of those major companies and their struggles both domestically, and really it's a kind of a whole developed economies phenomenon, and we're going to talk about some of the macroeconomic trends that would shape that. But look at some of these trends that we're tracking in carb, bev, and cereal. That cereal has been well documented in the press and the struggles of Kellogg's and General Mills in those categories. So those are the types of things we're corroborating when we see that. The only one that was up is water, up 4%, and then that's another thing where you can do a quick Google search. You'll see that water is actually projected to overtake carbonated beverage as the #1 beverage in the U.S. by 2017. So that is the only one out of the 15 that's on an uptrend. There were 3 out of the 15 that were flat, and all of the others were down substantially, and by substantially I mean 3% or more. So we're really talking about a very lethargic sector, I mean, actually in decline on a transaction basis. And we also understand that these categories have strategic value over and above just what they can derive from their own sales, and that they are driving traffic to the stores. So we expect that these weaknesses may have peripheral benefits in other categories. Now we said, what is driving these trends that we see in the categories? And what we identify is that it's fully a function of, or almost entirely a function of, very heavy buyers. So let me take you through what this data says. So we identified the trend. In cereal's case, it was negative. What percent of that is attributable to a decrease in very heavy buyers for cereal? And all of it was attributable to that. Now, you can see across the majority of these categories, all but 3 very heavy buyers explain the changes in sales, which is actually unusual. When I typically see what are kind of the underpinnings, purchase dynamics underpinnings of explaining significant changes up or down, it's usually more or less penetration, or more or less marginal buying. It's usually the marginal buyers that kind of dictate swings in trend. Here it's really the very heavy buyers. And so here you can see what is the contribution of heavy buyers to the overall mix. And so you can see it's cereal and carb bev. I mean, these people there's quite a few of their consumer base that's buying it very frequently. And when you have a drop-off in that base, that will hurt the category overall. So it's those very heavy buyers that is kind of at the root of a lot of these declines that we're seeing. And conversely, the increase for, say, water. And that's going to be important when we talk about deal preferences and deal activity. Then we looked at, well, is there a demographic component to what we're seeing in the weakness in consumables? And so we're looking at a 3-year trend. By age, we've also divided by male versus female. And if you were on the call last year for the second annual consumables study, the big news was a huge drop-off in female millennials, or females 18 to 34. And that drop-off continued. But that's not the big story this year. The really big story, and a story that we've seen for the last three years now, is a drop-off in households with kids. Now, why is that important? Well, as you can see here, the differentiation between percent of households that are heavy buyers, heavy consumables buyers, is the largest for this demographic variable. It is the demographic variable that has the most explanatory power in predicting if a particular person is a heavy buyer of consumables. So, for example, we can see 38% of households with kids, or people from households with kids, are heavy buyers versus only 20%. That differentiation doesn't exist anywhere, with the one exception of older consumers. Their heavy purchasing goes down a lot. And so it is very important and very relevant when we see this major demographic going down 9 percentage points, or almost 20%. So it's not millennials that is the target for consumables, and there's just this over-obsession with millennials in our sector. Now, that's not to say every category out there. We did a study in cosmetics where millennials were key. But in most CPG categories, they're not. It is households with kids that are the lifeblood of the industry. Also notice here, and this will be interesting when we talk about some of the macroeconomic trends, there's only a very marginal benefit, a marginal increase in heavy usage with higher income. So the percent of middle-income consumers that are heavy buyers, 27%. The percentage of higher income or upscale buyers is 28%. Very marginal increase. So that marginal gain doesn't help us. So if all the income growth in the U.S. and all the developed economies actually is focused here, that marginal gain isn't helping our industry all that much. So is because there's diminishing marginal consumption of consumables. Look across all of the various segments. So it's not as if one segment like soft drinks or ice cream or cereal or driving the preferences or the differentiation in kids versus no kids. It's across every single category that we looked at. Some, of course, are much more than others. As you would expect, cereal, the differentiation between kids and no kids households is much greater than, say, soft drinks, although at one point that was very high as well. But you can see that for the most part, there's this consistent decline in this metric. Not for all the categories, but for enough of them that translates then into an overall decline in heavy buying of consumables for households with kids. So again, just reinforcing that this is where your focus should be when you're talking about demographic trends in our industry. For the vast majority of categories is the households with kids. Now let's turn our discussion to deal tactics used. So the first thing to notice is that almost everybody uses deals, and uses deals regularly, not occasionally, but we said set your strong agreement that I regularly cut coupons from the Sunday paper. I regularly shop in stores that offer everyday low price. 89% of the people agreed. 35% of them use at least 5 of the 10 tactics, and that's what we would consider a heavy deal user. So what we did was said, what is the frequency for each amount of deal, reported deal usage? So look at how many. So this is saying in 2013, 6 people said they used 8 of the 10. The same thing in 2014, but it dropped in 2015. The more relevant analysis is doing that on a cumulative basis. And what we can see is on the last 2 years, from 2013 to 2015, there has been a 20% drop in heavy deal usage. So it is still a fundamental human need that people want and need deals. I mean, we're seeing 90%, but even that's a bit lower. It was at 93%, now it's at 89%. So that's also a meaningful drop. But if we see that 44% in 2013 were buying using at least 5 deal tactics, and now that number has dropped to 35%. So that's a 9 percentage point drop, and just in the last year it's a 7 percentage point drop, which translates to a 17% decline. So if you've heard some of my webinars in the past on kind of the false hope of loyalty cards and what's wrong with CPG, you kind of might be familiar with a term called discouraged deal buyers. And so what does that mean? Well, what happens is we ask about all these tactics, and you can see that 8 of the 10 of them, there was a significant drop in the amount of people participating in these specific deals. The only one to hold, actually 9 of the 10, the only one to hold flat is value sizes or large sizes. So for example, EDLP, in 2013, 68% of the people said they use EDLP. Now that number is down to 59%. So that obviously has implications for Walmart and the value channel and some of the other EDLP operators. Circulars are down 13%. But these are still what we call Tier 1 and Tier 2 tactics. Tier 3 tactics are also down. But what's important is that much of the focus, in fact, there's been a huge shift in retailer focus on loyalty programs and digital coupons. Both of them are secondarily preferred to the tried and true mainstream vehicles, and both of them have been dropping sequentially the last 2 years. And so you can see digital coupons, and I'll tell you, we've done plenty of analysis on the effectiveness or lack thereof on digital couponing. And the interesting thing is Kantar Media just reported a major increase. I believe it was 17% in the number of coupons actually offered digitally, and we're seeing a 10% decline in the amount of participation. And you really see that. You want to talk about in-market corroboration. When we look at the effectiveness of digital coupons, it's just not there. Those things are being virtually ignored by consumers, and you see it here, and you can see it actually in the data if you kind of just looked at your weekly sales data. So these are what we call a discouraged deal shopper, and so you can see across the board as offers become more confusing, less accessible, less compelling, all things that we've documented in past webinars, that they're dropping out. They've kind of given up and said, I'm not even going to try, or at least enough of them that it has a material effect. And as I mentioned, those two that retailers seem to be focusing on are also within that stream of going down, and they're not all that popular to begin with. This is a phenomenon we see with both active and passive deal tactics. So recall, of those that I'll just redefine it. An active deal tactic is something where I have to actively pursue to get a deal. I have to look at the circular, I have to cut coupons, I have to exercise my loyalty card. Passive means I just show up and I get a deal. The retailer's an everyday low price, or it's a private label, or it's a large size, or a bonus pack. So those are passive deal tactics. I don't have to actively do anything to get the deal. This is always interesting. Rebates going down 25%. Now, that's probably not statistically significant, just we're talking very low numbers, but you always see these huge increases when these retail manufacturers do these free with rebates, and I've kind of alluded to, and now I'll just kind of get out there and say it. I mean, there's definitely some nefarious activity going on. I mean, some racketeering going on redeeming those rebates, because the sales effect on those things is massive. And remember, you're redeeming those as your manufacturer. You're paying full retail to redeem those things. And there's just not nearly the interest or the preference by consumers on them. So that's a big, very difficult to reconcile gap. And I've seen so many people in our industry fired because they've executed one of those things, and just the bill was, the company couldn't handle the paying off on the bill to the retailer. So now let's look at why it's important that we understand deal activity and a decline in heavy deal usage. So what we're looking at is a 3x3 matrix, light, medium, and heavy, and this should actually say consumables buyers. So heavy consumables buyers and light, medium, and heavy deal users. So this all adds up to 100%. So if I'm looking at the top left, basically that's my biggest chunk of the consumer base. 18.6% of all consumers are light category buyers, consumables buyers, and they don't use many deals. So if I'm a light buyer of deals, there is a very small percentage that I'm a heavy buyer of consumers. So if I don't use deals, then it almost certainly predicts that I'm not a heavy buyer. So as much as we'd like to kind of wean people off of deals and make them buy on full deal, we just don't see that phenomenon. It's people that aren't, you really see that up here, is that there's this strong correlation between, and it's not a correlation, it's a causation, and I've kind of proven that on other webinars, of more deals equals more sales, but the caveat being more compelling deals. Now let's look here. If I'm a light category buyer, it's almost certainly that a very small percentage of them are heavy deal buyers. So it's not as if I'm subsidizing these light buyers. It means that the lighter I am, the less likely I am to be interested in getting my overall basket down. So you can see that a very good correlation, and this again I've shown as causation. The more deals that are used, the more stuff people buy, and you can see that in incremental gains, and particularly in consumables. It's not unusual to see incremental sales go up, by 20-fold. Now let's flip it the reverse. You want to get them off the cocaine. You want to get them off the needle, and any other of those well played out cliches that we can bring to bear on how bad promotions are. Well, here's one actual in-market. This is about as extreme as I've seen. I've seen dozens and dozens of people trying to get off a promotion. Here's one where they went cold turkey. This is a first year in light blue. You can see some pretty strong deals, big incremental lifts. The baseline's fairly stable. Then they just eliminated it entirely. And so how is that working out for you, Mr. Large Beverage Brand? I mean, this thing is flatlining and actually trending down. So the base now is down 18% from what it was here. It's not as if they've trained the consumer to buy on regular price. Those consumers walked away, and then what happened is this brand lost distribution because some of their marginal items that were propped up by this incremental business, well, they couldn't meet the thresholds anymore, and they got discontinued. So this is a cautionary tale. Now let's scale that up to a much broader basis, and this is exactly what happened to JCPenney. JCPenney went cold turkey on deals. They obviously lost all the incremental. They cut some of their most popular house brands, and their baseline went down as well. And so this is what we also see in our industry. We're seeing, instead of, you may have, go back to my one where I talk about loyalty cards, and I talk about the desert of despair. So long, sustained periods where people are going for weeks on end on just executing loyalty card and digital couponing, not getting any incremental gain, and wondering why their sales are way down. So now let's look at how these trends affect the industry, the outlet purchasing pattern. And so first of all, we looked at where do you make purchases of consumables regularly. Well, despite what the media loves to write about, traditional grocery is not dead. It's alive and well and doing pretty well. And in fact, in our survey, it went up. Now, there's an asterisk here saying some of this is due to the fact that we explicitly this year defined Meijer as a grocery retailer, but that still means this channel went up slightly and has been fairly solid every year we've done the study. Well, who's gone up? Also, natural food went up, but if you've been reading the trade media lately, their same-store sales are actually somewhat soft. So we would attribute this gain really to an increase in store count primarily. Who's declining? Well, Walmart and Target, and not so coincidentally, I would say, is a decline in interest in EDLP. Discount grocery, this was the first time we explicitly asked about this channel, and I was surprised at how big it came in. So 20% of the people now are saying that they buy consumables at discount grocers, and we said such as Aldi or Save-A-Lot. Those were the two we mentioned. So you can see it's actually almost as big as dollar stores, and there's probably 10 times more or more dollar stores there. Now, we know that discount grocers are adding quite a few units. Who's not much of a factor? And the same outlet that hasn't been a factor in consumables for the last 3 years, online. And you look and say it's been fairly static at 4% of the people buying there regularly, making at least 6 purchases per year. So that's not a very high threshold in consumables. And you see that most of them are still getting delivery. Pickup just still is less than 1% of consumers saying they do online ordering and then going to pick it up. Now we create a measure we call share of mentions, actually before I go there. And what that does is I say I'm going to add up 78, 57, 29, etc., all of those mentions in percentage, and then re-percentage those mentions by outlet. And what we found is that that number correlates pretty highly to data you would find in, say, household panel data or household channel facts that you can get from IRI or Nielsen. And so you can see that grocery has held their share fairly stable. Traditional grocery, I mean, think about who's in traditional grocery doing well. Kroger, Publix, H-E-B, Wegmans, Meijer that we've defined, all very successful. That's not to say everybody's doing great. Obviously, Albertsons are struggling. A&P went out of business. But for the most part, the channel's still doing solid. You see that natural food gain. Who's declined? Walmart, Target, and then you see CVS has had some declines, and that could be attributable to loss of tobacco as well. And then Sam's, interestingly enough, and I don't really have a good explanation on why we're seeing a decline there. Here's online again, very small. And we also see that discount grocers seems to have picked up a substantial amount of the share. Remember, this is all share basis. Overall transactions we're projecting is somewhat down. You see dollar that was actually up, and they were the growth story last year. That dipped a bit as we added discount grocers to the mix. So if you look at all the small format, that's where the battle is. You look at Walmart Neighborhood, Target Express, dollar stores, discount grocers, all the drug chains, and C-stores, and Whole Foods with a small format. So you talk about kind of the online, the battle for online grocery. I mean, that's the retail equivalent of a European battle over the country of Liechtenstein. I mean, it's just a non-factor. The factor in our industry is discount grocer. Now, I know there's the flacks that still want to know about online, and, you're not going to believe me when I tell you it's not much of a factor and won't project to be a factor for quite some time. So let's look at where people do say that they're buying. 66% of consumers out of 1,000 people say they don't buy anything anywhere in this sector online. So 2/3 are not buying online. And then there's this scrum for the top position among those that do between Walmart, Amazon, and if we aggregate up all the grocery banners like Kroger.com, Publix.com, etc. I was quite surprised at how these pure play grocers, how small they were. Net Grocer, Peapod, and Fresh Direct, because I certainly read about them quite a bit. And they're fairly, I thought, fairly prominent in the Northeast, but apparently not, because they really didn't register much in any particular region when I looked at the data. Now, here's a stat also that kind of tells you what you need to know about online grocery. So we have a measure we call stated loyalty. We say what percent of people buy regularly divided by what percent of the people buy at all. Stated loyalty for online consumables is only 12%. If we looked at that same number, and we've done some other studies for a typical food retailer, we're talking 70%. So there's just so far to go for online to be relevant in this particular sector, and actually many, many sectors, as we're actually now going to see in a couple. Also, we can use some of the deal buying behavior to understand purchasing patterns by outlet. So what we did was divide light deal buyers, what's the share of mentions among light deal, medium, and heavy. Interestingly enough, you see the biggest channels tend to lose the most share among the heavy deal buyers. So deal buyers like to search more outlets. That was one of the questions we asked. I search for the best deals. You can see heavy deal buyers are, and that's kind of the whole the absurdity of loyalty programs. Those people are the least loyal consumers in the entire landscape, except for maybe rebate buyers or something. But you can see that just by the nature of being a heavy deal buyer, I'm going to a lot of different outlets. And who benefits from that? Well, some of really a lot of the smaller format stores. So Walgreens and CVS do it by offering some of the active tactics, the high-low deals, the loyalty card. That's not to say there's not some people that respond to them. Obviously, and this data would suggest they are. All our data suggests is it's not the best way to go, or you don't want to over-rely on it. But you can see how the EDLP and the passive tactics are driving increased share in dollar store and discount grocers. Now we ask about some of the trendy topics, and one thing that came very clear is all these concepts had a long way to go before they're close to being mainstream, even among the vaunted millennials that there's just such a disproportionate amount of press on. So first thing we ask is a strong agreement on I try to buy organic drinks and snacks. And so you can see overall only 13% of the adults agreed with that. And we do a lot of different better-for-you concept work. And organics and gluten-free are almost always at the bottom of all the different types of better-for-you type of concepts you can think of. And so this is no different. Now, it is a bit higher among the younger shoppers, 18 to 34, but that's still only slightly over 20%. Households with kids, somewhat more than households with no kids. But, again, you're seeing very low numbers overall, and it's just not, at this point, a real mainstream concept. And you really see that at, the performance of organic items within a typical traditional grocer. There's a couple that do great, but, most of them are, now they generate incremental sales. I will say that. There's this kind of high degree of incrementality, but low degree of productivity. So that's kind of the quandary that retailers face when they're deciding what and how much of organics to carry. But let's go to the next one where you ask people on diet and low-cal drinks and snacks. Did they try and buy that? And this is an interesting dynamic, is the concept actually has lower appeal among younger consumers. So that's, I think, explains some of the issues we're seeing in weakness in diet soft drinks and some of the other diet products, diet frozen entrees. We didn't ask about it in this survey, but certainly we see it in the market, and it's been something that's received some trade press on it, the weakness, but it's almost as if the concept is aging out. It has the most appeal among the weakest consumables buyers, 65 plus. You see 34%, and it's in the 20s for people less under 55 years old. So that's only 24% appeal overall. I regularly research drinks and snacks online before I purchase them. So the whole showrooming effect, does that occur in consumables? The answer is no. It's only 6%. I mean, that's a very small percentage. What about the millennials? Well, that's 10%. Still very small. Still a minority of shoppers are doing research about this particular sector online. Now, if we were talking cars or electronics or durables of any type, I imagine it would be a much different story. But actually maybe not as different as you think, because then we said, I consider myself a heavy online shopper for many types of products. And so this would go beyond just consumables. Do they consider themselves somebody that gets online and shops for a lot of different things? And even here, this was a small number, 11%. So there's still a long way to go in general for online, and that's not to say there aren't certain categories that have a very high share of online. Certainly when we do our annual vitamin study, that's the largest channel based on our estimates, but that's an exception, not the rule in consumer packaged goods, and it's the far exception. And you can see even again among millennials that's 15%, so still very low. So these four on-trend concepts have a very long way to go before they become mainstream, but you wouldn't think that based on all the press that they're getting and based on all the disproportionate amount of investment from companies. So what do we conclude from all this? Well, first of all, the sales are weak. This is something that we definitely need to be concerned about, and we do understand that there's these macroeconomic headwinds. So I've talked in other webinars about the substitution effect. So not only CPG, but apparel is also very weak as consumers shift their preferences and their dollars to electronics and durables. There's also millennial economics. We call that the boomerang kids effect, where kids graduate or, after the age of 21, they come home. And you see that very recently in the U.S., those numbers have crept up meaningfully the last 3 or 4 years. And these people have lower income, less home ownership, delayed families. And then also, that's where that marginal income effect. So lower marginal consumption for CPG among the highest income groups. And when there is, as we're seeing in all the developed Western economies, a disproportionate amount of the income growth is going to the highest incomes, that means that there will be marginally less benefit to our industry. Now, what you're not seeing here are two things. First of all, the rejection of big food. And I would reject, I know that's been put out there by, I think, the CEO of Campbell's, Well, because first of all, the weakness is really sector industry-wide. It's not just isolated to food. And as we're seeing from this research, the transactions are going down on an all-outlet basis. It's not isolated to certain companies. Now, we know that there's smaller companies that have their heritage in natural food. They're doing well as they pick up stores and pick up consumers, but we also see that many of these brands, not all because there's a few very notable exceptions, but many of them struggle when they get to the mass market. So they're still kind of benefiting from that niche appeal. But in general, though, it's not a rejection of big food. It's a rejection of the industry in general, or kind of a shift in preference. But that's not to say there's nothing we can do. There's a lot of self-inflicted wounds. And first of all, it's an obsession on millennials being the core target when they aren't. It's households with kids. So that's a misallocation of a lot of the marketing dollars, is not appealing to our core target, which we should be doing. Also understanding that deals matter to consumers, and we take them away, you take away sales. We saw that one extreme example, and we've seen the cause and effect for all the various research we've done, and we really see kind of empirically this is a historically weak industry that we're looking at, and the lower amount of deal activity is a primary component of that. Grocery is not dead. Online's not a factor. And natural foods, although growing, is still relatively small. So again, a misallocation of resources and of corporate focus. Oftentimes, people tend to, want to try and develop online. It's still just not there. But they do tend to ignore discount grocery. Now, understand that Aldi, in particular, is very heavily oriented toward private label, and some of these branded manufacturers are having a hard time figuring out how they can play there. Well, as this channel gains more appeal, that's going to be something they'll have to figure out, because the appeal is not going away. That's something very strong in consumers' mind, and there's certainly more stores being added. And then organic is still niche, and it will be for quite some time. It's still a small percentage, always ranks among the lowest on all our better-for-you concepts, and ranked pretty low here. Now, keep in mind that discount grocery, you want to understand how big that's going to be. And that will have relevance in a couple slides. So what do we do based on all this? Well, first of all, focus on the lifeblood of the industry, which is households with kids, and stop messing around with millennials. I just had one client, I saw their marketing plan where they, talked at length about how they were going to cultivate millennials in each of their various segments, and it's like, guys, in particular, they were not the target, but that's all they wanted to talk about, not one drop on households with kids. Get back to delivering regular and, more importantly, compelling promotion. Deals do matter to consumers. It's a fundamental human need to want to find a better deal. There's utility from the thrill of the deal, and those deals drive sales. Quit chasing the niches, millennials and loyalty and digital promotion and online and organic and wellness, natural foods, to the exclusion of innovation and marketing in the mainstream. That's not to say exclude all of those niches, because niches can be a nice source of growth. But to completely ignore the base is pretty much what's happening in our industry today. And it just doesn't, the results speak to that as you look, again, empirically at the historically weak trends. Online in particular is not happening for consumables. It hasn't in the last 3 years of our research, and I would project it won't increase meaningfully without a major technological innovation. One of the big benefits of traditional retail is selection, and you just have a very hard time getting the experience of selection online. And for those that have gone on, and I would consider myself a pretty heavy shopper of consumables online, and I actually don't find the experience all that enjoyable. And I can see, because you just have a hard time getting that selection. Look at all these stats on the weakness in online. So it's a low share, 2/3 still not buying anything. The loyalty is very low, and really only 11% of the shoppers consider them heavy online shoppers for anything. The real battle is not online. It's discount grocery. There's so many players now competing for that niche. It's going to be very interesting to see how Walmart succeeds when there's just going to be so much competition in that space. So that really would be kind of, if there's any members of the media, that would be, to me, something that's more interesting, where there's going to be a lot more drama than online. So with that discount grocery is something that's important also, because what we'll see next month, and when the Canadian data, it's very big, and it might provide some insight into how big it could be. And so this is my tease for the webinar for next month. What this chart shows is just penetration by category, how it benchmarks U.S. versus Canada. But we'll not only do this for category penetration, we'll look at heavy buyers, we'll look at how deal preferences are different, how outlet preferences are different, and then all the standard things on how important are deals to Canadian consumers. Do they drive as much sales as we see in the U.S.? So all of that will be covered at our next webinar a month from yesterday. It'll be October 29th. And then also I would say, we do have deep dive consultations available, so there's people that have follow-up questions. Can you drill into this and get some more insight in category specific or retail specific, or you want to know cross-outlet purchasing or cross-category purchasing. All of that data is available in this research, and so we're more than happy to consult with you on that, and there's my email address. And so with that, I want to thank everybody for attending. I'm going to kick it back to Dustin and open it up for questions.
Great. Thanks, Kurt. What we'll do with the questions, if you'll see on the top of your screen with the chat section, there is the middle green button is chat. You can do a drop down on there and just type, and it will go to all, or if you'd like, you can drop down and select it directly to Kurt. So we'll start with that and let Kurt answer those questions.
Okay, I have one question on the demographic chart. It showed the biggest drop was low-income buyers. Do you have any theories to why this is occurring? That's funny. Somebody brought that up the other day. So there's two things I think that are at play. One is kind of a technical issue on the way we're scoring heavy, medium, and light. So because we're putting them in discrete buckets, so it could be just a very marginal drop in, let's say, one category would all of a sudden put what would be a heavy buyer into a medium buyer categorization. So there's some of that going. And what we did see, though, specifically is that there were a few categories, yogurt being one, I think carb bev, where there was a substantial drop-off in that demographic. Now, the overall effect was not nearly as extreme as you saw on that chart, but it was a substantial directional decline nevertheless, and it was focused on a few categories. Any other question? Okay. You included 1,000 Gen Pop in your research. Did you focus on a certain geographic location? No, we had a representation from all areas of the country. Just based on population, you tend to get more from the South, which I think has 35 or 40, close to 40% of all the people. But no, it was every region of the country. Another question, if households with kids are the heavy buyers, why are millennials still being heavily marketed to? Is it about getting these consumers into a brand's purchase cycle? I would say that's probably the premise, is that they're trying to solidify their purchasing behavior before they kind of really become heavy buyers. And it's a premise, and I've never seen any data to prove it. I think just in general, by virtue of people being young, they try things, and they will always try things, and so you're not going to establish loyalty just by kind of pure marketing. I mean, they're going to try things to identify what they truly prefer. there's also, I think it's kind of a glamour element, and I think people tend to, and I saw this always, when I was in marketing, people tend to have this kind of almost selfish bias on what, the consumer looks like me. And I mean, you definitely see that with kind of the whole upscale millennial, oh, well, I buy organics, my friend buy organics. Well, that's not mainstream. The people in marketing tend to be from affluent, well-educated backgrounds. That is not representative of this country. It is representative of the affluent, well-educated people of this country. And you saw in general how a lot of those trends are not projectable into the country overall. And I think that's probably the bigger part, is just that whole cultural bubble that people are in, that marketers are in. Any others?